So let's look at a couple of examples. So if P then Q, not Q, not P. Well, our first premise is a conditional, so we're looking good so far. The second premise is not Q. Well, the consequent of the first premise is Q, and so our second premise is the negation of that. So our second premise is the negation of the consequent of the first premise. So we have a conditional and the negation of its consequent. Those are the right premises. The conclusion of modus ponens is the negation of the antecedent. The antecedent is P. The conclusion is not P, so the conclusion is the negation of the antecedent. So this is modus tollens. Good. Let's look at another example. So here we have the conditional if P then not Q. So here the consequent is not Q. This is like if I will get fit only if I don't eat chocolate cake every day. Okay, so now let's think about what we need for the premise. So modus tollens for our second premise. Modus tollens says that the premise that applies when the second premise is the negation of the consequent of the first. And by negation we mean the consequent negated. So we take the consequent and we add a negation. Okay, so the consequent in this case is not Q, right? That's our circle. And we're going to add a negation to that. So that means if we add a negation to not Q, what do we get? We get not Q. And that's what we need to apply modus tollens. We have a conditional, and we have its consequent with a negation on the front. That's what we need to apply modus tollens. What do we get? We get the antecedent with a negation on the front, not P, so this is modus tollens. Good. Let's look at another example. So same first premise as the second argument, if P, then not Q. Let's let the other premise in this case be Q. So what do we think? Does modus tollens apply? Now we're not asking the question, is this a valid argument? We want to know if these are the premises to which modus tollens applies. Well, if they were, then we would get maybe not P. The problem is, if we look at these premises, modus tollens does not apply to these premises. MT does not apply. Why? Well, it's just for the reason we talked about in the previous argument. The second premise should be the negation of the consequent. And by the negation of the consequent, we mean take the consequent and put a negation on the front of it. Okay, well, so the consequent is not Q. So if you put a negation on the front of that, you have not Q. So your second premise needs to be not Q. Is the second premise not Q? The second premise, no, that's not what we have. We don't have as our second premise not Q. We have Q. So modus tollens does not apply. Now, you could do a derivation of this argument. It's a valid argument. But if you just look at what modus tollens says and you ask, is this what modus tollens looks like? The answer is simply no. There's nothing mysterious or fancy about that. It's just modus tollens says if you have the consequent with a negation on the front, you can apply it. We don't have that. We can't apply it. Are there other rules that we could apply? Could we derive the argument? Sure. But we want to distinguish between the question, is the argument valid, and does a particular rule apply? And yes, the argument is valid, but the modus tollens rule does not apply here. And why not? Nothing fancy. It just doesn't look right. That's it. That's all. It just doesn't have the right form. Modus tollens says the negation of the consequent, meaning the consequent with negation on the front, and that's not what our second premise is. So it's just not modus tollens. No, that's all there is to it. Nothing special. We just need to be paying attention to what exactly does modus tollens look like, and does this look exactly like that, and it doesn't. So it's not modus tollens. Okay, let's look at another example. So here's our standard simplest form of modus tollens. So suppose we have as our premise, if not P, then Q, and our other premise is not Q. So what are we going to get if we apply modus tollens? Does modus tollens apply? It does. We have a conditional whose consequent is Q, the negation of which is not Q, and that's our other premise. So we have a conditional and the denial of the consequent. So modus tollens applies. So what should we get if we apply modus tollens? Should we get P? Well, what happens in the other example? We have the antecedent, and that goes into the conclusion, and then we stick a negation onto it. Right? We add a negation. So have we added a negation here? Well, what's the antecedent? The antecedent of the first premise is not P. So we should be adding a negation. We should be putting a negation on the front of that. So, and if we did that, we would get not P. But that's not what the conclusion of this argument is. The conclusion of this argument is just P unadorned by itself all alone. And so it's not right. In this sense, it's not modus tollens. It's not the right conclusion. We need the antecedent with a negation on the front, and that's not what this is. Now, is this a valid argument? Indeed it is. You could do a derivation of it. Perhaps you will. But it's not just modus tollens. It's bigger than that. So what would you get if you did apply modus tollens to these premises? You'd get the antecedent with the negation on the front. The antecedent is not P. Stick another negation on there, not P. And again, that's just because what we've said, how we've said what modus tollens is. We could have said differently what modus tollens is. We could have had different rules, but we've chosen modus tollens to be the rule that we have, where it's on the right-hand side of the screen is what it looks like. And so you have to have a conditional and the negation of the consequent, and all you get is the negation of the antecedent. That's just what we said the rule is. So, we could have said something else, but we didn't. Is the middle argument valid? Sure, but it's not modus tollens by itself.